Of the hour now, success in a presidential debate can hinge sometimes on more than what is said by a candidate. Turns out their body language can reveal a lot as well. This shot here of the candidates before taking their podiums shows several of them assuming what's called the fig leaf position, which is a sign they're uncomfortable. Joining me now for a breakdown of what we saw last night, Tonya Reiman, body language expert. Great to have you on The Real Story, Tonya.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so what's the fig leaf?
Okay, so when we become uncomfortable, when we're anxious or insecure, we tend to cover what we feel is our vulnerable areas. And in this case, of course, it's the nether regions for men. So they sit there and they cover this area. And if you notice, Rand Paul was the one who broke. He broke for a few seconds, put his hand behind his back, and then suddenly that kind of brain went back into auto mode and he pulled his hands back into the front. So,
all right, so it shows that they were nervous, I guess, right, to take the stage.
Yeah, well, not just that. I'm pretty sure Megyn Kelly had kind of prefaced it like, let's give them a minute and see how they interact with one another. And that sends us off. We go, wait a minute, we're supposed to interact with one another? So we become nervous, anxious, and go off on autopilot.
Yeah, suddenly they're going to be judged for everything, right? Okay, now I want to play this. Of course, everyone remembers this from last night, the argument between Chris Christie and Rand Paul.
Senator Paul, you know, the hugs that I remember are the hugs that I gave to the families who lost their people on September 11th. Those are the hugs I remember, and those had nothing to do with politics.
All right, so what do we make of the body language of both of them?
Okay, so Chris Christie we know to be a bully to begin with, and it's accepted. People love him for who he is. But now you see Rand Paul, and every single answer, including this one, what does he do? He puts that sarcastic look. See how he looks down? That's kind of like, I don't want to be bothered, disrespect, defeat. And there's a look at that smirky contempt. So right here, he's told us with this exchange that he's contemptuous towards Chris Christie. But if you watched him throughout the entire debate, he did the same facial expressions, which was to look down, and he had this angry demeanor the entire debate.
Okay, so it maybe just wasn't against Chris Christie.
No.
Let's talk about Jeb Bush for a minute on the Iraq question that he had. So let's just look at that real quickly. Now, you say that there was something that he did with his hand.
Right. Well, when you watch him, he puts his hand in his pocket, which is also indicative of hiding something or being nervous about something. In addition to that, he smirks. And when you see somebody smirking like that, you realize they're also becoming a little bit nervous. So in this clip, when we're watching him, he also uses his non-dominant hand. So when you use your non-dominant hand for emphasis, there's a lack of conviction. So I'm a lefty. If I'm going to say something with conviction, I'm going to use this hand. If I use my non-dominant hand, it doesn't come across as passionate.
Wow, very interesting. Yeah. Okay, now let's talk about Donald Trump.
Oh, fun.
And speaking of hands, what did he do?
Okay, so here, when we talk about Donald Trump, look at how big his movements are. A candidate for president needs to keep their hands in controlled gestures. So you need to keep yourself in like a box, you know, chin to belly, arm to arm. What he does is he gets erratic and goes all over the place. He starts finger pointing, arrogance, conceit, and people love him or hate him, but he doesn't come across as a very presidential candidate.
Okay. Ben Carson. Now, specifically, you were talking about his closing statement. I want to show a snippet of that.
I haven't said anything about me being the only one to do anything, so let me try that. The only one to take out half of a brain, although you would think if you go to Washington that someone had beat me to it. But I'm very hopeful that I'm not the only one who's willing to pick up the baton of freedom, because freedom is not free and we must fight for it every day. Every one of us must fight for it because we're fighting for our children and the next generation.
All right. What?
He won points several ways. He was relaxed, he was easygoing, he was funny, he was humorous when he was eventually called upon. But he lost because a lot of his movements were considered beta movements, and that's the palms up. So again, as a candidate, you need to see how his hands are like this.
Yes.
That's considered like more of a submissive beta position. So you need to learn to do both. So he needed to take his words, which were charismatic, and then put them together with more dominant, positive movements so that he came across as more powerful and more alpha as opposed to more beta.
All right. So in your mind, winners and losers based on body language and what they were telling the viewer through that?
Losers, I would say Rand Paul. He really didn't do well. Most of the other candidates were neutral. Chris Christie didn't do great either. Jeb Bush was kind of neutral as well. I think the person who did the best was Marco Rubio. He was relaxed. His body language and his words were congruent. He came across as very good and strong and dominant. And I like that he was fluid in his movements. Of course, people are saying he looks so young. Well, yes, he does. But there's ways to address that if you are going to be the candidate.
How many of these candidates do you think seek out body language experts to help them?
I think the majority of them do. Here's what happens, though. You get into a place where you've been practicing for so long, but you haven't done real life things. So by the time we get to maybe the third time around, you'll see a little bit better nonverbal communication. Here, they're still kind of walking through. So they're nervous and they think they have it down, but autopilot kicks back in and we get nervous. We go right back to our usual positions. So if you'll watch, you'll see an evolution of how they increase, how they change their positions, their posture, and it'll get better as they go.
All right. Well, we hope that we'll do that along with you. Thank you so much.